But then what ethology has been most amazing at is showing types of learning that are simply unexpected, that break all the classic rules of reinforcement theory. One example of it is what is now called one-trial learning, which is another term that I think I used the other day, the one that's more classic that everybody learned back when, that animals will imprint on something after one round of exposure to it. And the classic example would be Konrad Lorenz and his famous little duckies, that when birds come out, there is a short period after which where they imprint on any big thing moving around on a fairly safe assumption that in most cases that big thing is going to be mom. That's how they bond to mom. There is a short window, what is now known as a critical period, where the bonding goes on during that time, and whatever big thing is moving around, and eventually people were doing classic ethology studies with subtraction and substitution of stimuli, and running around with like a stuffed big bird, and they imprint on that, and all sorts of large mobile objects, basically anything that moves, and that's where you would get, all the little duckies goose-stepping behind Konrad Lorenz when they had imprinted on him. And this is not by trial and error. Oh, I initially got bonded to this thing with sharp teeth and claws, and that was kind of a bummer. That involved all sorts of blood loss, so I've learned don't bond to that sort of thing. Well, then I tried bonding to Are You My Mother bulldozers, and then I tried bonding to this, and eventually you figure out your mother is the one you should be hanging out. No, this is not a domain where you can learn by trial and error, and what is seen instead is this phenomenon of one-trial learning. The first thing baby birds are exposed to in many species, the first big thing moving around, statistically likely to be mom, that's who you get attached to. And lots of interesting neuroethology has gone on over the years trying to figure out what are the mechanisms of imprinting. One of the things that come out is it's nowhere near as dramatic of critical periods. If you don't figure out who mom is in the next 7.5 minutes, you are up the creek. You will never, it's more a sort of relative term, but nonetheless, that's not how learning works. You're supposed to learn from trial and error that snakes and leopards and all of those guys are not good mothering models. But it happens. Another realm, something that came to be known as prepared learning, which is there's all sorts of ways in which some piece of information can be learned, or there's all sorts of sensory associations you could make with something, but you are prepared to make certain of those associations more easily than others. What do I mean by this? A classic example of it is what's called the sauce béarnaise syndrome. And sauce béarnaise is some fancy French food that seems very unappealing, and I don't know what it's made of, but this was first described by a guy, University of Pennsylvania, Martin Seligman, one of the most sort of major figures in psychology in the last decades or so. We will hear plenty about him to come. And this was one evening he went out for dinner where he had sauce béarnaise, and then he went to a concert of some opera or something, and then he went home, and for some reason or other, he got himself a terrible stomach ache. Terrible stomach ache. It was a total drag all night long. He had it. He didn't throw up. It wasn't that bad, but he had a terrible stomach ache, recovered from it. Weeks, months later, he goes out for dinner, and he goes off to this French restaurant and has sauce béarnaise, and is about to take the first spoonful or forkful or handful or whatever, and he realizes this smells totally repulsive to him. He could not eat the sauce béarnaise. He has never been able to since then because he's associating it with the stomach pains afterward. Remember, he didn't throw up. He wasn't burping up sauce béarnaise vapors or anything. So it's not like, oh, the taste was just like the acidic stuff that came roaring up the other direction, just associating with the stomach pain. Okay, that's sensible. I mean, that's not great, but you can kind of see how that happens. But you think about it, and that's breaking all sorts of classical rules of behaviorism and classical learning, which is if you were going to make an association, you can have a choice between an association of A with B or A with C. you're going to make the association more readily with whichever one comes closer in time to A. So what came closer in time for him? The opera. He finished dinner and then he went to the opera and spent hours listening to Wagner or something, and he didn't attribute his stomach ache to that. The next time he went to an opera, he was perfect. He was just fine with that. He had prepared learning for pain coming from your gut. You are far more likely to associate with food than with music. Prepared learning in us for pain in our GI tract with gustatory stimuli.